So it's my pleasure to introduce Professor David Lazer. He's a University Distinguished Professor of Political Science and Computer Sciences. He's the co-director of the NU Lab for Text, Maps, and Networks, and he's also a fellow of the National Academy of Public Administrations. David has done a lot of work in computational social sciences. You can see his work in Nature, in newspapers, everywhere. And I think of his long CV, I think I need to emphasize his role as co-lead of the COVID States project, which has charted public opinion in all 50 states through the pandemic. I think that work is a lot of impact in the whole US society. And today, he will talk about the emergent structure of the online information ecosystem. So David, thanks for being here in our expedition series of AI.
Pleasure to be here. And it's just going to take me a moment to share my screen because I may have, did I accidentally close my, no, I don't think I did. Hold on a second. This is the issue when you have too many things open apparently. Oh, there we go. Here we go. Can everyone see the first slide?
Looks good.
Excellent. Thanks, Joe. And thanks, Ricardo, for the kind introduction. And thank you all for coming. And I'm going to talk today about the emergent structure of the online information ecosystem. I should note that it's a sort of a story I'm wrestling with, like what is the big picture story, and how's the way I would tell it a little different from how it's been told to date. So I'll begin with the caveat that I'm very much wrestling with the right way to say this or tell the story. But in any case, this is putting together a number of different projects to paint a bigger picture. But before I get into the details, I should just note that a long list of collaborators that have worked on some of the papers around this, most of them actually students, or now some of them have moved on to bigger and better things. But in any case, this is very much a reflection of collective efforts. The sort of trying to put the pieces together is more my wrestling with it, but the pieces themselves are all very collective in endeavor, and I need to acknowledge that. So I begin with a question, which is, or observation, I guess, which is that the way we've we access political information in some ways has dramatically changed over the last generation, and I'll discuss that a little bit. But then the question is, what are the emergent implications of that? Some of the emergent implications of how we get political information, and I'm going to give a preview. This isn't meant to be a mystery where I don't tell you till the end, but I think that there are a number of pieces that together sort of paint a distinctive picture. That first of all, media consumption collectively has become much more homogeneous and concentrated in a few producers, whereas at the individual level, as measured by what publishers or producers you're getting information from, consumption has become much more diverse. That is, we consume from many more sources than we have ever consumed before. And that however, then at the individual level, at the story level, that content or consumption is likely more homogeneous, perhaps substantially more homogeneous than it is at the producer level. And there's a sort of a weird set of paradoxes here, which is that media consumption in some ways has become more homogeneous and more concentrated at the macro level, but then at the micro level has become more diverse as measured by who you're consuming from. But then again, at the micro level, if we're looking at what the actual content is, it's likely become more homogeneous. And so I want to spend the talk sort of unraveling this seemingly nested set of paradoxes. So I want to talk a little bit about the logic of how we consume news. You know, we can think of a number of different media through which we consume news. So newspapers, I should brought a newspaper here as a prop, broadcast news, various kinds, the internet. You know, we find stuff through search. We also find stuff through news aggregators like Google News. We find things through news feeds, social media, like Twitter and Facebook, where we go to Twitter and we see news content scrolling by. And then there are just lots of other beasts in the ecosystem: YouTube, WhatsApp, TikTok, Reddit, Instagram, Amazon. You know, that there are a ton of sources, ton of places where we may get substantial civic-related, politically related content, many of which we may not even think of as really being about providing news content like Amazon, but Amazon certainly is a medium through which people get a lot of civic and political content. So the interesting thing I want us to ponder is sort of what the macro structure is in terms of what the structures are, what the role individual choice plays within those structures, pre-internet versus contemporary internet. Of course, the internet is continually changing, so I'm really going to be focusing on the internet circa 2022. So if we think what the news ecosystem looked like pre-internet, there were a few layers, right? There was a national oligopoly in network news. So a lot of people got news from ABC, CBS, NBC. There were local oligopolies in newspapers, local television, and radio. So you know, if you were in Boston, say in the 1990s, you know, maybe you subscribed to the New York Times, but really most of the news content you were getting were probably from, you know, the local newspapers, local television, radio, as well as network news. And that, in fact, local newspapers were a really important conduit for national and international news. The Boston Globe used to have, you know, news gathering ability in other countries, which has been, you know, essentially eviscerated over the last 20 years. What does the internet look like? Well, the internet has a lot of these residual structures or providers like the Boston Globe and the New York Times, and also some many newly emergent ones. But I think the interesting and key thing to think about is you can choose among any producers in the world, sort of. I mean, there are various ways that access can be obscured or blocked, but generally you have a lot of choices of producers in a way that that just did not exist in the 1990s. And so what I want to reflect on is how that competition manifests, and then and what does it mean to think about having that choice among producers, and what does choice mean on the internet. And the way I want to, you know, to begin with is if we're thinking of something like broadcast news, right? If you're watching the network news, which is still an important source of news, in a way it's sort of like a price fixed menu. You have your sequence of courses that you work through, but really you're working through the predetermined list. That's if we're talking about a restaurant, that would be the chef that chooses it. If we're talking about broadcast news, it would be the people who run the network news who choose the sequence of content that you see. With newspapers, structured a little bit differently, which is because you don't literally go read a newspaper. Right? Here's the New York Times. You don't literally start on the first story and go through to the end of the newspaper, but instead you take peeks, right? It's sort of like a buffet where you can take peeks at things, but you have to stay within the table. That is, you can't go to the restaurant next door and say, well, I'm going to grab your soup because I like your soup better, and then run back to the original restaurant and get the rest of your meal there. You're sort of stuck with the set of content that's on that table, just as like with the new, and like with the newspaper, you're stuck with the set of stories that they've decided to offer and how they've written them. And you might take a taste, you might take a peek, you might go back for more, but the competition that's occurring is occurring among those dishes on the table from the same producer. It's not between producers or providers. The internet, I think, may be usefully conceived of as an array of choices among buffet tables. So, like, newspapers still exist, and they still have an array of content and I mean, literally paper. I'm old school. I literally have paper newspapers still, but of course, I also consume a lot of news online. And what this means is that for any given dish, you really can run to the restaurant next door or across the street or on the other side of the world, in principle, to get your dessert or your appetizer or your soup. And so there's this sort of decoupling in terms of the processes of competition, of being competition between newspaper, competition really, first, two-level competition. One is between buffet tables, like a restaurant A or restaurant B. And then once you've chosen a restaurant, competition for your finite attention among the bits of content being offered. So essentially what the internet has done is, by globalizing information, the internet creates a competition among news producers at the story level. Not always entirely, because there are paywalls and so on, but even for things where you have access to the paywall, you may decide, even though I'm paying for the Wall Street Journal, I'm going to read about baseball elsewhere, say, because the Wall Street Journal doesn't really do much sports coverage. So the internet sort of partially decouples the consumption of news stories from the same outlet. Like if we could literally, this would have been practically difficult, but if we could literally see what people saw in the 1990s in terms of where they got news from, we would have seen that New York Times readers got much of their content from the New York Times and maybe a few other places, but that really the consumption patterns clustered around producers, but that now there is literally competition at the item by item level, and that understanding us as such and thinking about how the social and algorithmic processes structure that competition is a key logic, perhaps the key logic of the internet when it comes to consumption of information, not just civic information, but information more generally. And so I think, just to give a sense of some of the prior research, and I'll try to, some of this will resonate with what I'm arguing, and some of it will be somewhat different, is there's definitely, I think prior findings on media concentration by Matt Hyman. There's been, I'm sure many of you heard of filter bubble research, with the idea that people are consuming increasingly homogeneous content. And then much of that filter bubble research has undergone a lot of critique lately, arguing that actually, if you look at individual consumption, their consumption is way more diverse than it could conceivably have been a generation or two ago. And so I want to unpack those seeming inconsistencies. So I'm gonna I have a few different methods and approaches here, and I'm not going to do a deep technical dive on this, but I do want to give enough of the technical details so you can understand sort of broadly what the strengths and weaknesses of the approach is. My lab has developed a matched panel of 1.6 million Twitter handles to voter data. This is a matching process that was developed in a paper we had in 2019 in a science paper looking at the prevalence of misinformation and fake news. And the key thing to note is that it relies on geo-unique matches in Twitter and voter data. It means that I am literally the only David Lazer in Massachusetts in the voter data, and I'm also the only David Lazer in Massachusetts in Twitter. And so when we see a case where you're unique, mutually unique in a geographic area in both Twitter and the voter files, then we declare that a match. And we have a paper out in Public Opinion Quarterly evaluating some of the biases in this approach and also evaluating it relative to recruiting people via surveys. This was a collaboration with Pew Research. Generally, actually, interestingly, the results and happily, the results largely converged in terms of demographics and behaviors. There were some differentiations and something we're wrestling with. So for example, it turns out that, and this was not something I knew, but women are more likely to have statistically unusual names, and that makes them more easy to match, to disambiguate. And that creates a bias, not a massive bias, but a few points bias in our sample towards women. We also underrepresent Asian Americans in particular, because Asian Americans are often present socially on Twitter a more anglicized or simplified version of their name, not first name, and not what is legally represented in their voter data. And so we substantially underrepresent Asian Americans. And so those would be the two significant caveats that I'd make in terms of this methodology. But the nice thing about this methodology is that it yields a very large scale picture with following 1.6 million people in an ongoing fashion in terms of what they're sharing and doing on Twitter. And so that's a very powerful tool, especially because we also know a lot about their demographics, because that information is embedded in the voter data. So we know things like partisanship, age, gender, geographic location. I'll also mention some secondary methodologies. These are things that are in the pipeline. We collected browser extension data actually in both 2018 and 2020. I'm not going to present the 2020 stuff right here. The 2018 data collection involved a survey company, YouGov. We actually had a larger sample, but then we asked people to load browser extension data in, obviously with consent and all of that, and that would track their online behaviors, and 265 users opted in. We oversampled in that survey Democrats and Republicans, because if you're not going to have a large sample, you might as well have one that has sort of large variance on sort of the key variable, independent variable sorts, and that we have not corrected for that oversampling in what I'm going to show you. And then I'm going to talk a little bit also about, mention the Facebook URL data, Social Science 1 data, where Facebook has made available aggregate versions of the Facebook of URLs being shared on Facebook. I should note, as a side point, observation is what's the power of a large sample, right? Because most social science methods do not rely on large samples. They focus really on small, but hopefully higher quality, although less and less often, high quality samples. And I think a key advantage is it allows you to look at uncommon behaviors. And I'd note that's more interesting than it sounds, because most interesting behaviors are actually uncommon. That if you're looking at how much people tweet about politics, actually very few people tweet about politics. And so if you want to understand rare behaviors, you either have to sample based on that behavior, or you need a massive sample. So for example, in our 2019 paper looking at sharing of fake news, we found that 80% of fake news sharing came from 0.1% of our sample. Now, if you have a sample size of 1,000, 0.1% is one person. So that's not going to be very useful to study fake news sharing or misinformation sharing. If you have 1.5 million people, that tail of 1 in 1,000 is 1,500 people, and that becomes much more useful. And then it also allows you to zoom in on subpopulations that you get. You can say, well, let's look at African Americans now. Let's look at certain age groups and gender and education. And if you have a very large sample, you can actually do that. So for example, I'm going to discuss the concentration and homogenization of news. I'm going to focus on COVID-related news coverage. I'm doing that in part because rather than looking at all news and civic content, it's just easier to it's easier to come up with a way of algorithmically classifying content if it at least has some homogeneity to it. COVID has been a pretty big topic over the last couple of years, so that made it promising. It also has sort of a distinct language to it, so we could actually pretty reliably identify COVID content. It also has the advantage that it has international, national, and local dimensions. And really in the US especially, we know local decisions matter a lot. And I'll point to these two papers, one led by Sarah Sugars and another by Ryan Gallagher, where we were looking at who tweets about COVID and who got amplified and so on. That's not going to be my particular focus here, but we are also borrowing some of the methods from those papers in terms of classifying content, for example. So how concentrated is sharing on Twitter at the domain level? So like how much, for example, how much is coming from of COVID related stuff that's being shared is coming from the top single source, top 10 sources, top 100 sources, and so on. And the answer is actually, quite concentrated. The top 50 domains on Twitter account for roughly half of the shares. Or looking at the top 2,000, at least accounts for roughly half of the sharing for the top 2,000. And like, you don't get much if you go beyond the top 2,000. And so, number one, that's pretty concentrated. And these are, well, speaking of the New York Times, these are pretty familiar names. I would put aside YouTube and Instagram as a little bit trickier because they themselves are like actually platforms for further sharing. But putting those aside, these are the top 10, and they're New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, NBC, AP News, NPR, Politico, Wall Street Journal. So all very familiar brand names, and interestingly, generally legacy suppliers of content, although Politico is at least new to this century. And if we look at just national domains, and so we separate international and local, and I want to talk a little bit about, well, how do things vary locally? That we can identify, we have a fairly simple way of classifying what is national and what is local, and if there's a disproportionate share that is occurring just in one state, then we call that a local domain, while other domains we call national. And so we can sort of separate into what's in local markets, what's in national markets, and we can see that the top 50 domains, unsurprisingly, it gets even more concentrated. The top 50 national domains account for 63% of the national market for content. And then I want to do a dive into Texas and New York. I chose Texas and New York because we have a lot of signal for those two states. They're very large state. We have a very large sample from both of those states. And we can see that the top 50 domains in Texas or national domains account for roughly 60% of the shares of national domains, and unsurprisingly, it's a lot more concentrated if we're looking at local domains, because there's just going to be fewer domains that are Texas focused, just 262. And if we try to compare, let's say, New York to Texas, and again, lots of signal, but also culturally very different places, what we see is that we do see a set of New York domains sorry, actually New York domains this is ranked. So these would be the New York domains, and then there are Texas domains, but then actually the vast bulk of the points are pretty similar and near the 45-degree line. And if we zoom in on some of the names here, it sort of makes a lot of sense, right? Like the highly ranked things, the set of things are highly ranked in Texas, but not in New York, or things like Texas.gov, some local news stations as news media, DallasNews.com. And then we can see what's above and below the line, that unsurprisingly, that there are things like Breitbart, which is more popular in Texas, more conservatives than in New York, still pretty popular in New York, similarly with Gateway Pundit, Fox News. These are all things above the line, and then you have things like BuzzFeed, New York Daily News below the line. But overall, it's actually again, most of the action is is up here with the most popular domains, and it's not actually radically different. It's different, but it's unsurprisingly different in terms of news consumption in New York versus Texas. And just to give you a sense of outlier URLs for a given domain, Just the News is a conservative tilting domain, but it's a national domain. We see that this was way more shared in Texas than it is nationally, and unsurprisingly, it's what's emerging here is a news story of particular interest in Texas. It's about it's from a story from a Texas hospital. I should note, Texas top 10 New York domains are very similar to the top 10 domains in Texas. So, New York Times is #1 in both. It's more popular in New York. It is a funny thing, I'll note, and this tells us something about just how dominant New York is as a news producer, that four of the top 10 domains have New York based names. The New York Times, Wall Street Journal, like literally one of the top 10 domains is named after a street in Manhattan, Bloomberg, and the New York Post. So it is a striking tell, and unsurprisingly, these are especially popular in New York because they do have somewhat more New York news, but these are actually all prominent national domains. And then similarly, we see some of the New York stuff drops a little lower in Texas, but New York Times is still #1, New York Times, CNN, Washington Post, and then you see like the Houston Chronicle emerge as sort of the #5 on the list, and then we see something like Fox News, which ranks lower nationally, still nationally oriented, but ranks much higher in Texas. And generally, if we look at the dyadic correlations among every pair of states, we see a fair degree, not radical homogeneity, but a substantial degree of homogeneity at the state level, with a median correlation of 0.62, just looking at the top, the rank order, the correlation of the rank order of the top 30 domains. And I should note that it's really better than this because we're measuring things with noise in a lot of places like Wyoming, DC, Montana. There's a lot of noise in those measures, and so this is arguably impressively high. So the takeaway here is based on our Twitter measure that there's definitely local differentiation in news consumption of producers, but it's a lot more homogeneous than it would have been, say, in the 1990s, where I can promise you, and I wish I could come up with a great comparison set, but like we don't have data like these in the 90s, but that the news consumption patterns in Texas and New York, beyond looking at the network news, would have been extremely different. So how concentrated are other measures of news-related consumption? This is based on the extension-based data collection, we, again, not a huge sample, not a quirky sample in some ways, but I think that this basic picture of concentration should be reasonably accurate. And we see, again, looking at the top 100 in terms of browsing history, what people click on and search results, what's shown in Google News, generally is extremely concentrated. And so again, there's, I think, this story of concentration in news provision nationally, and that that there are multiple things going on there. Of course, during this cause and effect, because another thing we've seen is a collapse of local and state news, and there's sort of a bit of a chicken and egg issue there in terms of concentration. But in any case, this is definitely one of the, let's say, emergent characteristics of the information ecosystem. And indeed, but in shifting to thinking to the individual level, I'd ask you all a question to reflect on, which is, I'm not going to ask for people to share this, not so easy online, but think about from how many news sources did you read at least a headline from in the last week, right? Did you at least get that modicum, that minimum modicum of news where you read something maybe for 2 seconds, maybe you moved on? And I suspect that this is actually a pretty hard question for many of you to answer, because you just sort of casually just see so much stuff floating by you, right? Like if you're on Facebook or Twitter or going to a news aggregator, you're just seeing lots of headlines. You're barely even processing necessarily what sources you may at least get that minimum level of exposure from. And that may be difficult even to say, where have you gotten the occasional story? There are probably places you may routinely go to, NPR or Washington Post or whatever, but that there are that you've gotten your bits of news from many sources, and so one of the things, and I think there's a nice paper by Andy Guess in AJPS last year, arguing that actually people consume news from a lot of sources, and the sources are fairly ideologically diverse. So, maybe people on the right watch a bit, somewhat more Fox News, are more likely to read Breitbart, but they also read some stuff from the New York Times or Wall Street Journal, and vice versa. And so that individuals are actually getting a pretty diverse of consumption, news consumption. But the question is, I want to raise here is can there be a diversity of sources but homogeneity of content? And so if we think of the internet as being sort of a buffet of buffet tables, that I could think of when my kids were young, if they had been presented with a set of options, they would not have come back with a plate full of diverse food, but they would have come back with a plate that looked something like this, right? 1,000 different kinds of donuts. And this is not, this may be diverse as measured by number of tables that one went to, but not diverse in terms of nutritional content. And so a question is how diverse is what people is consuming. And here I want to raise the idea of curation bubbles, which is that there is a social and algorithmic process that identifies favorable or consonant, ideologically consonant material from unlikely sources. So for example, the New York Times is shared more by Democrats than Republicans, substantially more so. But there are a number of stories here that, that were shared more by Republicans. So I don't know if people remember the needle of chances of winning the presidency from 2016, but that was shared more by Republicans than by Democrats. A very shared story, one of the most shared Republican tilted stories on New York Times was a negative story about Adam Schiff. They got an early account of accusations from a whistleblower, and then another very right-leaning story in terms of audience and sharing patterns was a critical story about the Clinton Foundation. And so we see these hints, if you just sort of look through what's being shared by Democrats versus Republicans from a single domain, you see actually pretty significant differences. And similarly, if you look at the National Review, very, very right-leaning in terms of being shared as vastly more by Republicans. But, you know, there are a number of stories there that got shared much more on the left, like House Judiciary Democrat Kavanaugh will likely be investigated for perjury. Another story, an epidemic of dishonesty on the right. Another one, an editorial by the editors, Trump's disgraceful endgame. And so again, you can sort of qualitatively see, those don't look like the average National Review stories. You can see why Democrats would like those stories. And so the question is, are the news stories being, is there a homogeneous process by which news stories are being produced? And we, you know, if so, we would expect sort of a distribution of URL partisanship scores to look sort of normal-ish in distribution. But the question is, do we see sort of a right-leaning tail? Let's say if we're looking at the New York Times, which is much more consumed on the left, do we see a right-leaning tail that is, putting it more generally, an audience atypical of a given source that is sharing that content? And so the question is are people curating homogeneous content from heterogeneous sources? And at the domain level, this could appear quite balanced and diverse, but then at the URL level, it would appear as selective exposure, as parsons engaging with different content, well, actually should be the similar content from different domains. And so, actually, I'm going to skip that. So what we did was we constructed a partisan lean score for every URL and normalized it from -1 to 1. So it's a left to right scale. So -1 is more Democratic and 1 is more Republican. We could do this because we know the partisanship of the people in the Match Twitter panel. And we could identify URLs shared by members of our panel in 2017 or 18. We can update this now, but we started with this was a big enough data set. We looked at only URLs shared more than 10 times, and this resulted in 1.4 million URLs from 83,000 domains. And we calculate partisanship scores for each URL in each domain. And we have this, we have a sort of pretty standard way of taking the blurb from Twitter that characterizes each URL to classify URLs as political. And what do we find? So, so like looking at the New York Times, we see this distribution. Most of the URLs are on the left, but then there is a sort of long tail off to the right that looks much more right-leaning. Now, of course, we're going to get a distribution regardless because there's noise in the process. If you have a URL that's been shared 11 times, you might get some that were shared just accidentally by a lot of Republicans. I'm going to get to that in a moment. But in any case, there is sort of this long right-leaning tail. It's not just a sort of neat, sort of roughly normal distribution. And similarly, let's say with the National Review, we see this sort of left-leaning tail, mostly right-leaning, but there's a sort of non-trivial left-leaning tail that appears. And what we do is to deal with the potential noise is that we simulate a distribution for for all the URLs, working on the assumption that domains produce URLs with a homogeneous partisan audience or potential, and so we're going to naturally get a variance for domains based on the based on the URLs in our data set, and we plot that. We run this a bunch of times, and we plot the 95 confidence interval here around the black line and the gray line. What you see is an awful lot of dots. Actually, most of the dots are outside of the gray territory. It does get closer as you get to the extremes. Unsurprisingly, you can deviate less. If it's 100% Democratic audience, well, then there's zero variance, but there's a lot of variance, unsurprisingly, in the middle especially. And that's becomes the evidence that there is a sort of curation bubble process. And diving more deeply into these simulations for 4 sample news producers, we see, let's say, for the New York Times, we can look at the overlap in distribution between the simulation and the observed data, and we can see, that there's just a much more pronounced right-leaning and actually a bit of a left-leaning side of the distribution for the New York Times than you would expect from the simulations. And you see the same for the Washington Post. These aren't like radically different distributions, but they're definitely different distributions than you'd expect if these were homogeneous processes. And it gets more interesting then when you look at the Wall Street Journal. For anyone who's read the New Wall Street Journal, it's very obvious what's happening here, that you see a bimodal distribution. This is definitely not a homogeneous process. All the left-leaning stuff is the news being produced by the Wall Street Journal, and that right bump is the editorial process, and the opinion pieces in the Wall Street Journal lean very heavily right. And so we see actually 2 semi-homogeneous processes within the Wall Street Journal, resulting in something that's definitely deviates enormously from the distribution. We see something similar, actually, interestingly, and this surprised me, in the New York Post, which is actually generally a very right-leaning publication. That's hence the right-leaning mode of the distribution. But one of the interesting things when we dug into like what the heck is going on with that left-leaning bump is that the New York Post has some blunt headlines that are sometimes favorable to or would be appealing to people on the left. So for example, there was this news story on Trump's trade representative spending $1 million on new furniture and blaming Obama for it. And this was a story that Democrats liked quite a lot. And the interesting thing then is we look at the domain level and we're like, well, let's classify how much Democrats and Republicans and independents look at content based on the partisan score of the domains. We definitely see Democrats and Republicans look different. Like there's a sort of right hump for Republicans that does not exist for Democrats, but actually the left side of the distribution for domains for Republicans is quite large, and that reflects the fact that the mainstream news leans heavily, does have more audience on the left, but that it has a lot of audience on the right as well. Interestingly, then the distribution it deviates, especially on the right, a lot more so that we see that distribution shift substantially as there's a sort of a curation machine that's picking out favorable news content from places like the New York Times and the Washington Post that distributes it on the right. And to some extent, you see that process going the other way, but far less so, that this is primarily a curation process being driven by people on the right finding consonant material in left-leaning mainstream media and circulating it on the right. So, you know, there's an interesting question here, and one of the things that we're still working on is the role that people play versus algorithmic curation. We're actually working, I'm going to refer to a project that's on the horizon to evaluate the algorithmic component. To what extent is this humans sharing content? And it definitely is, but to what extent are the algorithms also then promoting content from news feeds that they know viewers will like? Is this a sort of, there's a question of, is this a filter bubble redux argument that the internet is creating a possibility of seeing just favorable content? And the answer is actually a little complicated, because I actually don't think that local news media were like really serving up necessarily diverse news content. It would have been very hard to find pro-civil rights news in the South in the 1950s, for example. But that the nationalization of news distribution plus the social algorithmic processes that facilitate rapid identification of compatible content has yielded a concentration in news consumption and exposure, and patterns of homogeneous news consumption from heterogeneous sources. So that's my conclusion here in terms of like, what's the big picture thing that's happening? It's just a sort of concentration, but also then that whether it's truly less diverse than it was in the 1990s is actually a trickier question than it sounds. And then, you know, separating the social from the algorithmic, I actually think that they're sort of very synergistic, is difficult. Then the final thing I just want to note is an effort that we're launching that Krista Wilson and Dave Chofnes and others and I are launching, is with the support of the National Science Foundation, is an observatory for online human and platform behavior, which will allow us to dive into both the social processes of like, what are your friends sharing, versus then what is Facebook, what is Google, what is Twitter deciding to show you? And so my hope is that the objective here is to create a privacy preserving infrastructure where we get a large scale, tens of thousands of people to volunteer their online behavioral data, as well as what they see of platform behavior for scholarly research, for doing basic research. And so this is what I hope will help us answer, you know, some of the many unanswered questions, or many of the questions begged by what I just presented. So I actually talked a little bit longer than I wanted to. Sorry, occupational hazard, but I'll stop there and pause for questions.
Well, thank you so much for a fascinating lecture, David. Happy to open up the floor to questions. I'll start with Ray Pettit. Ray, would you like to ask your question directly? I'll ask you to unmute now.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Hi, David. So in the New York, Texas comparison, you know, New York City is a very large city. In the state, it makes up a large proportion, versus Texas, which has big cities, but of course they're more evenly distributed. Did you use some sort of weighting or stratified sampling to kind of avoid residual control variance later on in the analysis?
Not yet. So I mean, these were just sort of simple descriptives, and so one of the things you'd like to do is really to evaluate down to different strata what they're consuming, and see where there's convergence and where there are differences. And so like this was, you know, I think, you know, I'm pretty sure about that macro pattern, but like I'm also sure that there's like a lot of there's a lot of complexity that I'm not diving into or not illuminating with that sort of very simple analysis. So I agree that's sort of the direction I have to go.
More work for you. That's great.
Yes, yeah. There's unfortunately layers and layers of work in this stuff. So
next, we have a question from Silvio Amar. Would you like to ask your question directly, Silvio?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Hi, David. Thank you
Silvio.
for the talk. I was just curious about the pattern that we observed for the concentration of news sources. This study was done looking at stories about COVID, which is itself kind of a very contentious topic. And we know that there's some alignment in terms of geography, in terms of political ideology. So my question is whether we would observe similar patterns if we were looking at some other topic that is somewhat less contentious, if there is such a topic in U.S. society today.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. It's an interesting question. What isn't contentious nowadays?
Right.
So there are a few things. One is, this isn't something to take to cite, but I'd say, peeking at the data in many different ways, this is the concentration is a pretty robust pattern. And COVID was interesting. I mean, there's points of agreement and points of disagreement. Like, actually, I'd say most people, there's variations in how seriously people take it, but actually, a large majority of people actually take COVID pretty seriously, and are at least anxious about it. So there are points even within COVID of agreement or interest, but I'm not sure. My own intuition is, if I were to formalize a model of this, and this is not, again, it's sort of been thinking about why does this arise, is that people are, information is differentiated, but it's not infinitely differentiated. And when you nationalize the market, then suddenly you can say, you know what, I was getting the news from the Boston Globe, which used to have, I think they used to have a newsroom. I think they had a newsroom in Moscow years ago. But actually, if I'm going to choose it from one place, New York Times is better, right? So even for things where we all agree this is important stuff, that you would tend towards the best information provider in the niche that you care about. It's just a question of differentiation. That's, I think, ideological differentiation is so important. I do agree with Amanda's question would be an interesting one, because I actually think there's a fair degree of agreement about, in certain ways for now, about some of the things that are going on with the Ukraine. And so it is an interesting question there. I will say that, peeking at data, when we've looked at things like particular emergent crises, like when Trump was infected with COVID, that there seems to be a flight to quality to the big mainstream sources. So I think of things where people are like, oh, I just want to find out about what's happening. There's probably more concentration in news consumption. And then I'm guessing that if you were looking at something like consumption about baseball news, you would see more differentiation, because some people care about the Dodgers and other people care about the Red Sox, and those are coming from different places. So.
Yeah, Amanda, if you'd like to ask your question, it sounds like we have a nice segue here.
Who's that?
Amanda,
me?
Yes, if you can go ahead with your question, that would be great.
Sure, sorry, you touched on it, so I wasn't sure if you wanted me to continue, but I was wondering how all of this changes when it gets to a more global view, where you're dealing with news that's being completely filtered by one nation to its own people, and then also when the rest of the world is sort of united in position against that one view. And what we've seen a lot of is opposing, bipartisan support, which has been such a, been so separate in the news up for the last several years, and now it seems to be coming together. So I'm wondering how that changes things when opposing views unite on a topic.
Yeah, no, I think that's an interesting question. And I think there are two things that you're sort of touching on here. One is that it's truly a global ecosystem. And so, but with different structures in different countries, obviously, content coming from Russia or China, for example, not just Russia and China, but many countries has a very different has a very different process of circulation and production. But like you can access that in the US. And so there is, and indeed we see some global news producers in our top, especially UK based, BBC, The Guardian, et cetera, are ranked very prominently. Daily Mirror ranked very highly in the US. So there is an interesting question of how these different systems bump up against each other, because I've talked about like the nationalization of news, but it's also the globalization of news. And what will this, how separate do our news ecosystems across the world remain? And that's an interesting question. But then the second dimension you're touching on is like when there's something like the Ukraine emerging, like how's that reflected in news consumption? And again, my intuition is that if we peek at the news at the first couple of weeks, that we would find Ukraine-related sharing was especially concentrated, because that people wanted to go to the places that had the most view on the ground, and that there was more of a flight to the bigger, better resourced news producers as compared to like more opinion-oriented news. I mean, that a lot of the stuff that's emerged over the last generation is sort of opinion stuff, which is cheap to produce. It's easy to have it's cheap to have an opinion about Ukraine. It's expensive to actually have reporters on the ground seeing what's going on. So my guess is that it's actually, for US news consumption, probably concentrated down to a smaller number of news providers, but like that's a hypothesis that maybe will be proved wrong when we get around to looking at it.
Thanks, David. We got two more questions from Matthew and Carrie, and just for speed, I'm going to ask them both and you can address them. I think they're related in some ways. First of all, Matt asks very point blank, most people aren't on Twitter. What do you think these results tell us about those people? And then Carrie Rappaport asked, more broadly, some of your results seem to differ from popular intuition. Well, why do you think this is ... Just emotion?
First one first. Twitter is often, Twitter I think is important, but you're right. It is, if you were to choose a few social media to study, I would, Facebook and Instagram and YouTube all have much higher usage rates than Twitter. Twitter is just much easier to study. It also does have a particular role for the national discussion, but like 1 in 5 people use Twitter, and probably a substantially smaller number who are really accounting for the bulk of the activity. I am part of a group that is looking at Facebook, and so we're looking at some similar issues vis-a-vis Facebook data. So my intuition is that many of these same processes, and actually some of the stuff we're peeking at with the Social Science 1 data, it does seem like there are some similar stories that I can say out of the Social Science 1 data, the URL data, that match the story for Twitter in terms of the curation processes. But again, come back to me in a few months and I'll confirm that or not confirm it. In terms of popular intuition, I just think that there's just a lot of work to be done. And I think that intuitions, I think filter bubble, everyone thought the filter bubble was a thing. And then, and we're pretty married to it. And then I think it's gotten pretty substantially debunked in recent years. And now I think what we're finding is something that's a little bit more nuanced. But part of it is popular intuition, but part of it is just science changes, and that the entire information ecosystem has changed over the last generation. We don't have great tools actually to study it. And that just means that we've all been scrambling about how to best study it. And that's again, part of what I'm trying to do with that last project is basically to provide something like the Hubble telescope, but for the information ecosystem. So I think that's actually a good note to end on. Thank you all again for coming.